So this month, one of our HCCO board members, Catherine, will give a presentation on United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in December of 1948 in the aftermath of World War II. After a short summary of the 31 rights, we will have a group discussion of how the Universal Declaration of Human Rights relates to humanism, whether all the rights are applicable to the current era, and what, if anything, we as humanists feel need to be addressed both in the philosophy of inalienable human rights and in their application in the United States. So, without further ado.
Thank you. So, welcome. And man, oh man, oh man, this is a huge turnout. I'm a little nervous now. I wasn't before. And I'm very happy to see Zateria and Cal and Fred, you're new as well. So welcome. Thank you for coming and checking us out. We really are very nice people. We are a little bit insane, but we are very nice people. Please feel free to come back. Feel free to email. My email is certainly on the board. As a board member is on our website, I think. Right, Carl? My email, my contact information is on the...
Check. If it's not, it should be.
I was going to say, yeah, I never check this stuff. But seriously, if you have questions, especially for you people that are here for the first time, and don't feel like you want to ask a question in the middle of this group of very scary strangers, feel free to email me, and I will try to help. Hey, Bob, what?
And there are at least 2 people here who live near here who came to this meeting for their first meeting.
Oh, yes, cool. So, I'm so glad that everybody decided to come out on this wonderful, wet, drippy, muddy January day. So, it was interesting hearing your responses about what human rights mean to you. Because many of the things that you touched on are things that actually are either in the Declaration or in the Humanist resolution that's in your handout, or are things that are ongoing discussion areas that anybody that deals with human rights and disadvantaged populations sees all the time. So my goal for this talk today is to give you kind of an overview of the UN Declaration, a short overview of our Humanist resolution. And you have the handouts in front of you, so I'm not going to insult you by reading it out loud like you're 3, because I'm assuming everybody here can read. And then what I really would like to do is hopefully we can just kind of break into a discussion as a group and say, what did we get out of this? Do we agree with these things? Do we disagree? Are there areas that are lacking? Are there areas that are no longer relevant? Is this something that we need today? Is this something that maybe we don't see being followed through with in this country at this time? Is there something that we as individuals want to do? Is there something that we as a group want to do or feel is important that we address? Or as part of a national organization, is there something that we want to address nationally? Or do we want to continue to keep this as our education? So there's no pressure ever for anybody in this group to have to do something. But I want people to be able to start thinking about options and say, hey, you know what? I'm really glad I came, I learned about this, and that's good. Or I came, I learned about something new, and you know what? I'm really fired up because there's a problem here, and I want to go out and solve it. That's cool too. So this is to provide you with some information, give you some resources, generate a discussion among us as a group. And maybe we decide to do something, maybe we don't. If you have questions for me, yell at me, okay? Please do not throw tomatoes because I don't want to have to pay for the screen. And I apologize if I'm slow with technology because I am not very good with this stuff at all. Why do I have a picture? Who knows? So, this picture did not show up on my PowerPoint.
Surprise.
Surprise!
It's a devil did it. The library faculty.
So let me give you just a real quick history of the Declaration. So it was adopted December 10th. That's why I'm seeing this. Of 1948. Now, the thing we want to remember is that the writing actually started a couple years earlier, right at the end of World War II, right as the Allied forces had gone into those concentration camps and had found the atrocities that had been committed. The millions of people dead, the carcasses of people everywhere, the medical experiments, you know, the just, again, absolutely horrendous situations. Eleanor Roosevelt, yes, that Eleanor Roosevelt, was one of the driving forces. And she had had a long history of being involved in social justice issues, but it was overshadowed to some extent by her, you know, role as First Lady. Now, this declaration was the first time in recorded history that there had ever been a document that said there are universal values that accrue to people regardless of what country they belong to. There are, and I'm sorry, Carl, because in the summary I gave you, I wrote down 31 articles. There are actually 30. I cannot count. But I can think of a couple of other articles maybe we want to add in the future. So the UN voted on this thing, and there were 58 countries at the time. 48 voted in favor, 8 abstained, and 2 didn't vote at all. It was very interesting to see the abstentions. And we'll get to that toward the end of the talk when we talk about why people abstained. Because it goes back to the socio-political climate in those countries. The really interesting thing is, though, when we look at this, again, Eleanor Roosevelt was the chair. She's the name that everybody thinks of. Most of the writing was done by René Cassin out of France. He did most of the heavy lifting. There were 9 people on that committee. Eleanor was the only woman. But if we look here, we had a lot of women that were delegates that were lobbying. And we look at women of color that were lobbying. Hansa Mehta, Minerva Bernardino, Begum Shaista Ikramullah, and Lakshmi Mena were all women of color. Talking about rights for women, talking about marriage equality, talking about equal pay for equal work. Yeah, John, no tomatoes.
No tomatoes. Do you know how they lobbied? Were they in positions where they could exert some sort of influence, or did they lobby like, I mean, Eleanor was just the first lady, so she had, well, she was in the committee, but these others were not officially in the committee, so can you...
Yeah, so they were not in the committee, but because they were influential within their countries and they were delegates to the UN, they were, I'm assuming, I haven't read a lot about what was going on because I couldn't find a lot of documentation. I'm assuming that they were doing a lot of behind the scenes, you know, twisting people's arms, basically. I will
in their
have to look
respective
at it.
countries.
In their respective countries with their respective delegates. And remember, you know, we've got 9 people on this committee that were doing the writing. So I'm just going to assume, because we look at, it's interesting, we also look at, you know, we've got a heavy UK block there with Canada, the UK, and Australia, as well as Roosevelt from the United States. But I am assuming that what they were doing is because, again, Eleanor, having come up with social justice issues, women's rights issues during her tenure, not only as First Lady, but again, activism before that, was probably very easily approached by these women and made sure that their voices got heard because she was so influential. Yeah, Ken.
I have a dumb question.
No questions, Don.
You said marriage equality back in 1948?
For
LGBT?
no, unfortunately, no.
I was
That wasn't even
1948.
on the radar.
Okay.
But marriage equality at that time was considered a very radical thing to say that men and women had equal rights before marriage when they were separate entities, during the marriage as a shared entity, and after the marriage and dissolution. So that was considered radical, which is very interesting when we think about how, you know, differently we look at things now. Randall, do you have a question?
How common was the women's right to vote at this time? And was it by this point pretty much universal in most advanced countries? Or I know that's a loaded way to say it, but can you answer that?
Because, and I can't really answer that because I didn't look at it. You know, women's suffrage happened in this country, of course, in 1920. In the UK, I want to say it was 1935, but I can't swear to it. But if we look at, you know, some of the what we would consider now to be developing countries, I don't know, for instance, that women had the right to vote at this point in Afghanistan or in Siam, which is now Thailand. I'm looking at the list here. I don't know if they had the right to vote in Iran or Iraq. Yeah, Pakistan perhaps, I don't know. It would be a very interesting thing to follow up, certainly.
So, what is that, the Declaration of what?
So this is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
And how is that related to the women's suffrage?
Well, the Universal Declaration says that every single person basically has these 30 rights that they have regardless of whether they're male or female. And one of those things, as we'll talk about when we get further in, is the right to have a say in their government. So if that is a universal right, that follows then that if it's a democratic system and voting happens, women should have a right to vote just as men, that people of color should have a right to vote just as people in the dominant population should. The irony, of course, which isn't lost on any of us, is that this was happening at a time and being spearheaded at a time by the United States at a time when Jim Crow laws, of course, were still completely and utterly accepted in many parts of this country. So, when we look at the vote, again, there were 48 in favor. There were 8 that said, nope, we're not going to make it happen. We're not going to vote on it. We had 2 that just didn't, I couldn't find anything, whether it was they didn't show up, they didn't care. Well, you know, I couldn't find documentation. But out of the 8 that abstained, South Africa, no surprise, abstained, because they had apartheid in place. So there was no way they were going to vote for something that said equal rights for everybody, regardless of color. Because that would have put their whole system in jeopardy. Saudi Arabia abstained because of the statements about marriage rights and the ability to change religious beliefs. They said it was in conflict with their system of Sharia law. Not surprising there. What was interesting is that Pakistan and Afghanistan voted for this, even though they were predominantly Muslim countries. One thing that I really found interesting is the USSR and other countries in the Soviet bloc abstained because the declaration didn't condemn Nazism and fascism. That was the reason they gave. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt, in her personal writings, said that she thought they abstained because, of course, one of the tenets of the human rights is the ability to freely travel. And these countries did not want to let their people freely travel, especially out of country. So her thinking was that they abstained because of that clause in the Declaration. Come on, silly computer. There we go. Now, we talked about enforcement and having something that's legally binding, right? Here's the thing. Okay, this thing was adopted in 1948. People said, yeah, it's a good idea. It wasn't legally binding. There were no teeth behind this. We basically said, here are these things that people should have, but we have no way to enforce this. Evidently, the people from Great Britain were really, really annoyed by that. And I haven't been able to find any writings about that, but from what I was, as far as what they wrote at the time, but evidently they were frustrated that this wasn't a legally binding thing. It took us until 1976 when the UN passed I'll get you, John. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights was passed by the UN in 1966, but it actually went into force in 76. It took until 1976 for the Declaration to have legal status, for most of it, not all of it, yeah.
So did they expect that they were going to come up with some legal binding and some enforcement procedure when they created this?
Because I don't know that they did. Now, remember, this was passed in '48, right after World War II, when everybody was saying we are not going to ever have this happen again. The Nuremberg trials, which of course unearthed a lot of what had been done to people during World War II, were still going on, because they went on from 45 to 49, if I remember correctly. So I think there was some idealism in passing this because people were saying, well, let's pass it, and everybody will say this was a good idea and we'll never do it again. You know, because think about it. We can say, this was horrible, we need to pass these resolutions to protect people, right? And people, of course, are going to follow them even though there's no penalty for, you know, refusing to follow them. So, John, I don't know how idealistic the UN was at the time, but I suspect that some of this was very idealistic thinking because the people that were working on this had all gone through the horrors of World War II together and banded together to say it's not going to happen again, ignoring the fact that in a generation people will forget that experience because they haven't lived it. You know, and think about it. You know, there's always going to be somebody, if there isn't repercussions for their actions, there's always going to be somebody that will want to act for their own gain. You know, and as we noted, legally binding and enforceable are two very, very different things. We see that all the time with laws in this country. So I'm not going to read the whole preamble to you, but basically we've got a declaration that has a preamble that says, here's how we got to this point. Here's our basic founding principles. You've got a shortened version of the preamble in your handout that basically boils down all the gobbledygook into about 3 sentences. This is just a little bit more flowery language. And what we're going to do, Carl and I talked about this, we're actually going to put links to these handouts and to this PowerPoint someplace available, right, Carl? So that if you want to go back and find the whole PowerPoint, you know, and read this whole thing on your own, you know, we'll make it available to you. And it's also, of course, on the United Nations website. So if you Google United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, you'll get to their page. Also on that page, which I found very interesting, by the way, was actual audio footage of Eleanor Roosevelt reading that declaration once it had been ratified. So it's evidently a radio recording. But basically it says, look, we recognize the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members in the human family as the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. What's really interesting is all members of the human family, not all men. The original wordage was all men until, remember that group of women? A couple of them got together and said, no, it's not men, it's all people, it's all persons. All men is not inclusive enough. And second one's really telling, because again, we're writing this right after World War II, during the Nuremberg trials. Disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. Okay, so it sets the stage for when they're writing this. Okay. Again, I'm not going to bore you with reading all of this out loud, but the high points are, we recognize there's inherent dignity. We recognize barbarous acts happen and we don't want them to happen again. And people need to have a recourse to help protect themselves. Because we're never, ever going to let that happen, in theory. So, then the thing gets into the nitty-gritty, which is 30 articles, not 31, I cannot count, that basically say, here are the things that are really important. First 2 articles are kind of the foundation. Okay? Talk about equality and human dignity. Next articles, houses basically, if you're building a house, you put your foundation in, then you start putting in walls, and eventually you put in a roof. So then you put up a wall, the rights of the individual. What are those rights? Then you put up the second wall, next set of articles is the rights of the individuals in civil society and politics. And we look at another wall, which is spiritual and religious rights, rights to education, rights to belief or not belief. Okay? And then social, economic, cultural rights, right to experience, right to growth, right to education, right to knowledge, freedom to explore knowledge. And then finally, which I think was really, really interesting, because it would have been easy to leave this part out. Rights come with obligations. Just because we say we have rights doesn't mean we have the right to trample over somebody else's rights. And I think those are really important to remember too. We forget them sometimes. Maybe not so much here in this community, but we see that a lot of the time, especially in modern society, where somebody will say, you know, I believe this, and you have to believe this too, because it's the right thing. We've all seen that. So, you know, one thing I've heard said sometimes is, you know what, your rights stop where my rights begin. And we're still trying to define where that boundary is. Okay. So again, I'm not going to read these out loud to you. You have the shortened version in your handout, which basically boils it down in less flowery language. But Article 1 says everybody's born with free and equal rights and equal dignity. Article 2, you should never be discriminated against, not for any reason. Everybody has rights. And I'm going to blow through these pretty quick because, again, you got the handout. Then we look at those rights of the individual. Okay? Life, liberty, and security. Kind of sounds like our Constitution, doesn't it? No one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Well, we still have human trafficking in this country. We're not doing so great on that one. No torture, cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. Well, we're not doing so great on that one, are we? The right to be treated as a person, right to be treated equally under the law. Yeah, I'm seeing some eyeball rolls.
Depends on how much money you got.
Yeah. And this is one of those things, again, when we open this up to discussion, think about these things. Think about let's talk about this. And remember, our perceptions may be very different from each other because of our experiences, our socioeconomic status. So my experience as a white cisgender female may be very, very different from somebody else's experience as a white male or a person of color or somebody with a physical or an intellectual disability. Okay? So remember, these are still the rights of the individual. Again, if your rights are violated, you have the right to recourse. You're not subject to arbitrary arrest, detention, exile, trial, fair and impartial trial, everybody presumed innocent until proven guilty. Innocent until proven guilty, by the way, was one of those things that, again, was fairly radical at the time. And there's still, as far as I know, legislative systems in countries in this world where it's guilty until proven innocent. So keep that in mind. For those of you with legal backgrounds, you would have a better feeling than I do for what those two different ideas, innocent until proven guilty compared to guilty until proven innocent, means for somebody who's on trial. Thank you. Then we get to the rights of the individual within society, especially in politics, especially when we start talking about things that, don't make elected people very happy or our leadership very happy, whether they're elected or not. First one I think is telling. No one shall be subject to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence. So, things like wiretapping. Things like search and seizure. You have the right to your country. Everybody has the right to leave a country and return home. And following that, number 14, you have the right to seek and enjoy asylum from persecution in other countries. These, I think, are very telling given our current climate. Article 15 is also very telling. You have the right to a nationality. We've seen in the news lately people stripped of their nationality, especially young women that went and became brides to the Daesh fighters. Now, whether they made good decisions or not, is subject to debate. At 15, how many of us can honestly say that we made good decisions all the time? But bottom line, should they be stripped of their nationality? Because in some cases, these women now have no nationality. They're persons without state. And what do they do then? Article 16, you have the right to marry or not marry. And equal rights to marriage, during marriage, and at its dissolution. That one really puts some people's noses out of joint. Marriage shall be entered into with free will and consent. That was put in there to help deter child brides and child marriage, specifically by the 2 delegates from India. And the right to own property and it can't be taken from you. So how does that reconcile with some of the cases where police will seize property when you haven't been proven guilty of a crime?
Or that a president has dictated a wall is going to be a certain place, and you may or may not get paid for the property, the government.
Yeah. Yeah. So we could have some really interesting discussions, it sounds like.
Well, and also another thing, back in 1942, if you happen to have a Japanese last name,
Yes, Japanese
even though
internment.
you were a native-born citizen, you were ordered, you had to go to a certain place
Yeah.
and be, as they call it, relocation, which
Yeah.
was actually concentration
Yeah.
camps.
And if we go back further than that, of course, we look at the Native Peoples Genocide, which is something that, interestingly enough, at least when I was growing up, wasn't talked about in history books, and still isn't. And neither is Japanese internment, beyond maybe a footnote. Because it doesn't fit with our cultural narrative of us being the good guys. What? Okay, I'm not going to let you two sit together anymore if you're going to sit there and start laughing. Bad people. Bad children.
I would also add that our textbooks hardly get opened these days because children are learning tests.
Yes.
And some of those textbooks give mere sentences and not fact
Mhm.
in their content.
It's because they come out of Texas.
Yeah.
But I will say this, on a more positive note, I judge history papers for Ohio History Day for high school students. And a lot of these topics, are young people writing really good papers.
Yes.
About Japanese internment, the rules and laws against immigration in the early part of the century, slavery, undergrad, I mean, really, really good. So there are some young people out there who are researching and learning about these very complex topics, and some of them do a phenomenal job,
Yeah.
better than some college papers I've seen.
Yeah. Now, we've got some very, very just brilliant young people out
So
there.
there's some bright spots too.
And,
I
yeah.
do that every year, and it just rekindles
Yeah.
a little bit of belief.
And those bright spots give me hope for the future.
Yeah.
They really do. My mom was a history teacher, so I grew up with some of this stuff around the table, probably more in depth than many kids, because she taught it, she talked about it at home. If you want a non-mainstream take on history of this country, the history of this country, look up Anthony Zinn, The People's History of the United States.
Free Speech TV.
Howard Zinn.
Howard, thank you.
And he wrote a second one too. That
Yeah.
kind of takes.
It's been a while since I read them. I still have them on my shelves. If
Yeah.
anybody would like to borrow them, I want them back.
By the time he wrote his book, he was a speaker at HCCO.
Yeah. It's a fascinating take, and it certainly is not mainstream. And it looks at people and situations that are otherwise marginalized and ignored. And in my opinion, especially, my mom was teaching in Connecticut in white upper-class public schools. For students that had grown up in those bubbles of privilege, having them read Zinn was very eye-opening, as it should have been. And I think it made them think. And certainly my own child, I made her read them as well, which got me lots of eyeball rolls. But it's part of what informed her decision to become a social worker. Yes, sir.
I've often wondered how my thinking would have been changed in my youth had I had incorporated into my education the teachings of Thomas Paine into my government classes. I cannot remember honestly, ever, unless it was something that may have, I just can't remember, ever learning about Thomas Paine.
Yeah.
Maybe they do now in schools, but or his,
Yeah.
his books or teachings and.
Either yesterday or today, the Common Sense was published. I can't remember.
Yeah.
I think it should be required reading.
I'm sorry.
I just looked at echo what he said. I think there are more green shoots. I mean,
Thomas Paine.
what's one anecdote worth? But in my high school in suburban Milwaukee in the late '90s, we really went into topics like that, internment and native genocide, whereas probably 30 years ago there would have been much less of that. But I think there, and I've been in other countries like Turkey where they don't talk about the Armenian genocide at all. So I think I think things are not maybe as dark. I think there's room for some.
Yeah.
We're not afraid to self-criticize, but there's definitely room in American discourse to criticize more.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Also, I think we need to give credit to Professor Gates with his, where he does the DNA. Yeah, he shows how diverse we are.
Yeah.
And I remember when they had Condoleezza Rice's mouth dropped open when he reported to her, oh, guess what? 41% of your DNA is European.
Yeah.
And that's like I had one of my first cousins found out here he's related to the Shawnee.
Yeah.
Right there. And when I look back, I wrote a letter to the Dispatch and mentioned where my ancestor, John Bradley, when he wanted to better himself. He came and landed in 1803, just when Ohio became a state. And I said, if this is him coming to better himself, how's these other people different that we're trying to keep out? Because there's never a time that this country hasn't benefited from immigrants.
Exactly. If you go back far enough in anybody's family tree.
Well, the Indians might argue with that.
Pretty much. Yeah. Because I look at my own family tree, and once your parents retire, it's funny how they have all this free time and have to find hobbies to do. My dad started doing genealogy, and his family came over as indentured servants around the time, probably shortly before the American Revolution. So these were people who were coming over in essence in slavery, although it wasn't called that because they were whites, it was indentured servitude. Yeah, but they were immigrants. They were the interlopers. They were probably part of the genocide that happened to the native peoples, unfortunately. So yes, I look at the current issues with immigration thinking, just because you got here first doesn't mean that you're allowed to deny other people the same opportunities. And we can go into, that's a whole other topic, right? No, come on. Thank you. I talk to computers, especially when they do things I want them to do. It makes them happy. Happy computers makes for a much better presentation. So spiritual and religious rights of individuals. This one's really important, I think, for us as humanists. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, freedom to change religion or belief. Because as humanists, because we're not still considered mainstream, and especially by the more rabid religious groups, sometimes, we're told something is wrong with us, that we shouldn't be, thinking this way. We have the right to freedom of thought. It's kind of nice to see that codified a little bit, I think. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. Even if some people don't really want us to realize that. Article 20, everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. We have the right to protest. Not the right to throw rocks through people's windows, not the right to beat each other up, but we have the right to go out there and associate and express our opinions, despite what some people would say. And we look at Article 21. And this was, again, one that we talked about voting rights. The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage.
We're still working on that.
Oh, we're working on that one. And it's this one's very telling because, again, think about it. This was ratified in 1948. This committee was spearheaded by a woman from the United States at a time when most people of color were still disenfranchised. We've got it right here saying that people should be able to vote. Everybody should be able to vote. We still have people disenfranchised. Goes back to that whole, legally binding enforceable stuff that we're still fighting.
The thing that's sort of implied here is we need to respect another person's beliefs. And that's, I guess it kind of goes without saying, but that's a lot of times hard for us to do, you know.
Yeah.
We think they're wrong and I'm right.
Yeah.
But they have a basis for their beliefs and we need to respect that.
Yeah. And there's a difference, though, and I'll get to you in a second, Laura. There's a difference between respecting their beliefs and allowing their beliefs to control what we are allowed to do.
Well, they need to respect our beliefs.
Yeah, and that's the really hard thing.
It goes both ways.
Yeah, it does. And Lori, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I like what Ed was saying about, like, you know, and you said earlier where your rights stop, my rights start, where your beliefs stop, my beliefs might not intersect appropriately. I heard an interview on NPR last week or the week before, and they were talking about how long Putin has been in office. It's been 20 years, so a whole generation. And they were talking about how their upcoming elections are going to be almost useless because he has done such a great, secretive, systematic job of getting rid of his opposition. So even when people don't agree with him, they end up missing or squelched, their speech is denied. And so they'll have the elections, but it's not going to be a genuine election because the current generation who are now able to vote, who might have been young when he came to power, only know him. And so the brainwashing, and I use that word lightly, but if you don't know anything else and you're not sure what happened before, if you don't know your own history, you're inclined to just go along with it. It becomes an apathy rather than an interest. That bothers me.
And we see that here. I interned for my social work degree at a drop-in center for homeless young adults here. And one of my first jobs was to get people registered to vote and provide them with information from both sides of the aisle in preparation for the elections last fall. There were so many people who said, well, my vote doesn't matter. It's not going to get counted. Because they've been told all their lives they didn't matter. They didn't know any different. So they assumed because nothing in their life, you know, their actions hadn't mattered, their agency hadn't mattered throughout their life, why was voting going to matter?
What's your answer?
My answer was one vote might not make a difference, but if you vote and your friends vote and their friends vote and their friends vote, before you know it, we've got the 5,000 or 3,000, whatever number of votes was the difference between the winner and the loser in, you know, my district, for instance. It starts with one person. And one person can change if they work at it. The other interesting thing, by the way, this whole, of course I already shifted screens on you. This whole concept of universal and equal suffrage is very interesting as well. Because most of the people I was working with were people of color. Guess who got challenged at the polls? Those young people of color. And fortunately, I was there as an advocate because I was helping get people back and forth to the polls, so I could advocate for them. Had the information to say, you know, what do you mean this isn't correct according to, you know, what we've got from the state attorney general? This is the correct documentation. So, you know, just because we've got something on the books that says voting has to be available doesn't mean it's going to happen. We see that played out all the time. And again, we need to think about that. Yes, sir.
A way to handle that, I would suggest to everyone here, if they can have the time, volunteer to be a poll worker. And also where they say, oh, my vote don't matter. I live in Fairfield County, a very conservative area. In 2007, of course, by accident, I became a Democratic committeeman for, and I didn't hide my atheism. In 2010, I did vote, lose, but I take pride in one thing. You know how much I lost by? One vote.
Yep.
So one vote does
matter. Yeah.
And get involved with the election process. I'm also a life member of American Atheists, and I mentioned to American Atheists, encourage people to be involved.
Yep.
Now, the way, as I understand in Ohio, if you're nonpartisan, you can volunteer. It used to be you had to either register as a Republican or Democrat, but that's changed. You can register, be a nonpartisan.
Right.
In fact, one time I had a unique thing when a voter asked a question. You need to have a person from another party. Well, when I found out that this one person's nonpartisan and I'm a registered Democrat, I said, "You'll do. Come with me." But you know, you learn, and also, what better way to keep an eye on the process?
Exactly. And you know, I think bottom line, keep an eye on the process is an important thing for us to remember. All right, talking about social, economic, cultural rights. Right to Social Security, right to work, right to equal pay for equal work. That was put in there. Behest of the women again. Another one telling. Article 24, right to rest and leisure, including reasonable limitation of working hours, which isn't happening for people that are working 2 and 3 jobs to get by, and periodic holidays with pay. Ooh, that's pretty radical. Okay. Oh, and look at Article 25. We talk about universal basic income sometimes. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family. Okay, notice the gender-inclusive language didn't get there. Including food, clothing, housing, and medical care for Lindsay. So, we've got this going back, you know, over half a century now, saying we need to pay a living wage. That we have a right, if we work, to be able to live in decent conditions, to have time off.
Harry Truman tried to get universal health care coverage enacted in our own country. Well, the Republicans defeated.
You know, it's just, we have a history in this country, as anybody with a history background knows, of, you know, if you don't eat, you don't work, you don't eat. I mean, we basically have a mindset that dignity is not a universal right. It is something that you only get if you work for it, which is very diametrically opposed to the mindset in many other countries. All right, let me buzz through the rest of these, and then we'll get to the humanist take. Article 26, if I can read this. This is for everyone has the right to education. Higher education shall be equally accessible to all on the basis of merit. How the hell do you pay for it? Okay. And everyone has the right, looking at number 27, to freely participate in the cultural life of the community, to share in the arts and share in scientific advancement and its benefits. I think that was really important now because, again, thinking about how expensive healthcare has gotten, everyone has the right to freely participate and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. You can't share in it freely if you can't afford it. And finally, when we look at, come on, silly thing, rights come with obligations. I really like Article 29. Everyone has duties to the community. In other words, just because you got these rights doesn't mean that you still don't have a responsibility to other people. And the second part of Article 29 goes back to that, where does one person's rights and another person's rights begin? Because it says, okay, they're determined by law solely for the purpose of securing due recognition and respect for the rights and freedoms of others. My rights end where your rights begin. You don't get to trample over somebody else's rights just because you got rights too. So we buzzed through those. Again, you've got the handout in the shortened form, and we'll get the information up on the website. Or somewhere, Carl and Randall will work their magic for me, because I'm abysmal with technology. So let's think about humanism. You've got a handout that is the resolution affirming human rights for all. It's done by the American Humanist Association, September 2015. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it is long, but it fills in, I think, some gaps that just weren't on the radar back in 1948 when this thing happened. So, humanism, this is taken directly from the AHA website. Progressive philosophy of life, yada, yada, yada. Really important here. Second paragraph. Regardless of race and all these other descriptors, all individuals have universal human rights that must be respected and protected. Doesn't matter what the descriptor is that we put with you. If you're a human being, your rights are respected and protected in the humanist mindset. And the AHA goes one step further, I think, from the Universal Declaration, because it says the inherent right of all individuals to freely make choices that affect themselves and their person. Which, again, is hinted at in the Declaration, but isn't really explicitly said. But so far, a lot of what the Humanist Manifesto is saying falls into line with that Declaration, and in fact agrees with it pretty closely when you look at it step by step. So, this is part of the resolution of 2015. Again, the full text of this resolution is on your handout. But the Humanist Association affirms the worth and dignity of all persons. I think that's very telling. And it does so without saying we're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. You know, and I could go on, and of course we could probably always cite that. But we recognize as individual human beings, we all have rights. Everybody has rights. The individual has rights. And that's very important. Now, when we look at, and grab your handouts for me, because I want to take just a very quick look at that resolution of affirming human rights for all. This resolution specifically says that family planning is supported. A woman's right to make decisions is supported as far as her bodily autonomy goes. When we look at the UNHCR's document, the Declaration, because again, this was written in 1948. So remember, marriage equality for LGBTQ continuum was not on the radar yet. It was considered radical for women to have marriage equality. So there's no language in that declaration about LGBTQ rights. So it wasn't on the radar. But our humanist resolution does say that the right of all persons to have signed affirms the right of every person to be affirmed in their sexual orientation and gender expression that best fit their personality. It affirms the rights of people, again, in an area that the original Declaration, again, hadn't even touched on yet. Which I think is very, very important, because our Declaration as humanists recognizes that sexuality is part of our expression, is part of ourselves as human beings. And it is never the right of anybody else to impact that expression as long as it is something that doesn't impact the rights of others. The other thing, thinking about Oregon's right to death with dignity laws, which, Fred, I think you brought up, right? And Diane brought up as well. As humanists, we affirm the right of the individual to make those decisions. Again, that's nowhere on the Declaration because that wasn't on the radar yet. This wasn't. We weren't there yet. So who was it that said, you know, our human rights are kind of an evolving thing as we gain greater understanding, as technology advances to some extent? I think you're absolutely right. So, on the bottom of the Humanist handout, for anybody who is really interested, there's a lot of good information on the Humanist website. You have to do a little bit of digging. I didn't find it very easy to find stuff, but that's just me not being good with computers. So, thinking about what we've talked about today, I've got 4 questions I want us to think about. I'll get the computer to cooperate. Thank you. First of all, do we as individuals and as a group agree or disagree with the Declaration and Humanist Resolution? What do we think of that? You don't have to answer it. I'm not going to do a pop quiz even though I threatened. But what do we think about that? What do we as individuals think about it? Do we want to, as a group, have a discussion about it? Is it worthwhile? Are the documents relevant to the current era? What changes would we make? I can think of half a dozen easily. Because again, our understanding of what it means to be human, our understanding of human rights have changed and continue to change. Okay? So, third one, International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. It's a legally binding document that codifies a lot of what's in the Declaration. I think it's safe to say it's probably not enforceable, given that we're in violation of a lot of those right now with our current status on immigration and asylum and things like that. So, we need to think as individuals if we want to say, how do we get our political leadership to comply? Do we want to? Is it worth our time? Again, these are decisions we have to make as individuals. I know what my decisions will be. But this is something we need to make as individuals, and hopefully have some group discussion about it if we're inclined. And finally, what can we, as individuals, as a local organization, because remember, we're saying good without God, and as part of a national movement, what can we do to support human rights in our immediate spheres, in our local environments and our national environments? Do we want to do that? Do we choose to do that? Those are questions I think that we should all be thinking about. Again, this is my personal opinion. I think they're important questions for us to ask. And that is it, people. There's a reference page if anybody is really, really, really curious. But thank you for being so patient with me as I rattled on. If you have questions, please yell. And you're allowed to clap, yes. Up what?
Did the UN Declaration, did it say when your rights begin?
No.
No hint of when?
No. Which is interesting, but we didn't have the technology that we have now to see developmentally what happened during gestation, for instance. And I don't think it was on the radar. Because to all practical intents and purposes, for instance, hormonal birth control hadn't really been developed yet. Abortion, to all practical intents and purposes, was illegal for most of the world, for most women, except for very, very rare cases. So the assumption probably was that we're not even going to talk about it because it's not going to happen. So, yeah, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to make mention on the right on a couple of pages earlier. There was the freedom from compulsory compulsions and stuff like that by government or other entities, but I'd like to still bring to everyone's attention that for the most part, persons in our community, I would think, I can only speak on from whence I came here in Columbus, but for the majority of anyone struggling with substance abuse disorders in our community, we were compelled, if we so choose, the only available treatment options were religious and spiritual in nature, and we didn't really have a choice.
Yeah.
And for those that thought differently or had a different worldview or whatever, but so we've got some work, I think, still yet to do in that area, and they're making strides, but one-size-fits-all approach and excluded and denied the rights of many people for decades in this country who were in desperate need of help.
Yes. And I still see that. I see, because I live in a very conservative little rural county. And for social services in general, not just substance abuse, but even things like, fortunately not our domestic violence shelter up there, but even things like...
Have your attention, please. Mark Shroop is in the library. Please come to the front desk.
Mark, are you here? But even for things like food stamps, even for things like food pantries, for things like those free hot meals, they're all church-driven up there. And in many cases, you get the hot meal, but you have to sit through a church service first. You know, which is, in my mind, very coercive. You know, it's great that churches want to do good. Don't get me wrong, it's great. And I'm glad they do, because otherwise a lot of people would be hungry. But don't make people sit through something that is contrary to their belief just to get food. That, again, to me is very coercive.
The American Humanist Association just put out the Free Mind newspaper that just came out, but some of you just got it. There was an article that I read this morning about a man who was in prison in North Carolina and was denied his rights to assemble with the Humanist group. And so that just went up against the North Carolina state legislature, and they just decided for him that he had this right, but I mean, don't we? I mean,
You said you fought for 7 or 9 years, something like that.
Yes, right. In prison, and didn't have, like, the Christian groups all met and the Islamic groups all met, but he didn't have any rights as far as that was concerned. So I think, I'm glad that the Humanist Association is, like, doing something, you know, about this. Like,
I found one of those little, you didn't mention it, but it said parents have a prior right to decide what education their children are going to get. Where do I start with that one? Because I've met a lot of really ignorant parents in my life. You know, and then the kids kind of follow. I mean, I see with all my relatives and everything. It's like, you know, 4-year-olds saying prayers and saying that, well, you know, Uncle Henry's in a better place now because he had a stroke and died. Well, yeah, that's bullshit. I mean, a hole in the ground's not better than driving his truck where it was before. But that whole thing of local control of education, and that so often just leads to unbelievable ignorance. So that's one, I would strike that one completely out of there if I had the option.
Although freedom from religion has, because a good example, Jackson County had their nice little picture of Jesus up. You know, they made the mistake of challenging FFRF. You know how much they had to pay out? $95,000. Nothing like hitting a person's pocketbook to get a point across.
But again, this goes back to why this kind of discussion is important, because we want to look at that document because it is so important from a historical standpoint, because it did break a lot of ground. It was considered radical at the time. But that mindset that parents have that power and responsibility to educate their children is very dated now by our standards in many cases. There are other parts that are dated too.
I was talking to somebody, there's a school in Plain City, Shekinah Christian School, they actually have a book entitled Christian Math. That blew my mind. I mean, I understand their Christian history and their Christian science. Okay, that's an oxymoron, I understand, but Christian math, 2 + 2 is 5. I know in higher mathematics you can prove that, which is
well, they're probably working on proving how many angels can dance on the head of a pin.
Matter if the Noah's Ark was so long and so wide, how long did it take to look?
What happened to Angela, what have you got for me?
I wanted to say in response to what you had to say about education, my background is as a special education teacher, and I think that at least in the realm of special education, what parents have brought to the table has been so valuable.
Yes.
You know, without parent advocacy, we would not be where we are with educating students with disabilities.
Yeah, I work in the children's hospital. Parents are amazing when it comes to discussions. I'm speaking more generally, like with history, with what gets omitted from teaching history. Because I work with veterans groups who are inevitably very religious, and they're always like, well, history's not being taught the proper way. And I look at them and go, I agree with you, it's not being taught the proper way, but teach it the way you want it to be taught, that we're always right and the other guys are always wrong.
Yeah, I know. Carl.
About in general how we treat children. There's an entirely depressing subreddit where it's basically kids that are under the age of 18 and their parents are anti-vaxxers, and measles is going around their school, and they're trying to figure out how can I get vaccinated without my parents finding out? How can I get the flu vaccine without my parents' consent?
Because children still are treated like property. And if you notice in the Declaration, children are not mentioned. not specifically beyond the fact that motherhood and childhood are sacred things and deserve societal, support. But as far as the rights of children to self-determination, and when you think about children who are wanting to transition before they're 18, there's a whole, you want depression?
If they get pregnant, then they're an emancipated minor.
Yeah, but for a boy who wants to transition to a girl, they're kind of out of luck that way, And why should that status of whether or not you end up pregnant or not? Why does that? There are a lot of inconsistencies, and it's potentially we've got a lot of really hard questions in front of us.
Also, I might add too, one guy, local guy, he's I've been years now, for decades, by the name of Frank Sidler, worked to try to get the religious exemption withdrawn where it involved medical treatment.
Well, I can see, I'm a retired paramedic, and this is a scenario we always use to teachers. Kid gets hit by a car right here. Parents show up, do not treat my child. Do you treat the child? Do you not treat the child? And the legal standing is you always do what's best for the child regardless, even if you have to call the police and say, restrain those two parents, we're taking the kid to the hospital. I said, you want to go with that argument to court rather than saying, yep, we walked away and let the kid die. So,
I'm sorry, John.
So there is some legal common sense left.
Well, looking at the UN articles, one thing that came to mind is I think for the U.S., the United States at least, I think the issue is really in the details, because I think a lot of both Democrats and Republicans would agree with most of these.
Right.
But when you start talking about, like the one that's talking about having the right to a fulfilling life if you're working, I could see where people might say, let's say somebody considers himself an artist, but they can't sell any of the art because nobody likes it. So does that person deserve to earn a living off of their art? And then that article also talked about, or you get some sort of type of welfare. It sounded like if you don't earn enough.
Support system.
But I think the implication there would be, assuming that you're trying to get a good enough job, and boy, there's all kinds of ways you can play with that. And that's where that's a little bit more towards how do you implement it, enforcement, and what do we really mean by this, and then I was also thinking about a lot of this had to do with privacy and freedom of thought, and we're living in an era where terrorism is a problem, and one of the ways we protect ourselves from that is the government is spying on us. And so there's some balance to be maintained there.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff that I don't think is, I think on the surface, I agree with that. And then you start talking about it, maybe.
The devil is in the details. Yeah. And it goes back to that constant flex between boundaries, right? Between boundaries between individual people, boundaries between the individual and the community. Where does the needs lie? Where does the greater good lie? Those are tough questions. They're not questions we're ever going to answer, I don't think, unless we become far more enlightened than we are. Maybe not even then. They're tough questions for us to answer as individuals.
I think you just hit a key point. It's one of my frustrations. It's just, obviously, this room is the exception to the rule. Thinking is hard. You have to have an open mind to think and reason. If you thought, I got conservative friends that are very intelligent, and they've come to their conclusions by thinking things through. I still think they're wrong, but I can respect the fact that they thought it through. But just to be the ditto people, and because someone appeals to your innate prejudices, how do you fight that? That to me is the frustrating thing, to see people I know that I respect and like supporting, I put Dumbo Trump. I just can't wrap my mind around how in the world can you support this person. So, but thinking's hard. It's like, how do you get people to?
Here's the thing. And if you've taken psychology, if you've taken sociology, you've probably got this somewhere along the line. we have innate instincts that drive us. Survival and reproduction are the two, right? So if you appeal to somebody's survival instinct and say, we're winning, we're doing better, they're probably going to go along with you more than if you say, well, you know, things really aren't going all that great. And of course, if you control their ability to explore sexuality and reproduction, that's an easy way to control people. Those are two very, very easy ways. And if you engage people on an emotional level, it's a lot easier to control them than if you engage people intellectually.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we all know that because we're thinking rational people. You know, I wish more people were thinking irrational. Yes?
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to push back a little bit against universal suffrage. I heard a podcast and I'm reading a book on and off that's very interesting, and it advocates for at least experimenting with what it calls an epistocracy, where voters would require licensure. Like a plumber would need a plumbing license, and you'd have to, know stuff. And in one of the ideas you mentioned, one of the balancing acts is determining where, your rights stop, where mine begins, and voting to the extent that it does make a difference is imposing upon other people. And I thought that was very interesting.
It could be a really interesting thing to try, however, because of my background and the field I'm in, we've got a lot of data that says, let's take standardized testing. Let's take the SAT. We've got a lot of data that says there's test bias there because the people that write it are white. And we know that people of color, people from disadvantaged backgrounds, so for instance, kids from rural areas, rural farm kids, even though they're white, tend to score disproportionately lower, just like people of color do, because they don't have that same basic lived experience. So if you're going to require a test to be able to vote, you got to look at test bias, because it could effectively disenfranchise people that are quite capable of making good informed decisions, but because they don't have the access to education, they don't have the access to that lateral learning experience that we take for granted. We take for granted we're going to have Saturdays to be able to come in here, right, on a semi-regular basis. Not everybody has that. But let's say you've got somebody who needs to take a class to be able to license to vote, and that class, they can't make it because they're working 2 jobs to survive. Should they be disenfranchised because of that lack of financial opportunity?
And we've also used tests intentionally to discriminate.
Thank you, yes.
And I think the author...
Well, just to correct, we meet monthly.
Whatever.
I just want to make sure new people are here.
Okay, no more Rockford cake for you.
Yeah, I don't know how, I haven't gotten to the part where the author, or I don't know how many people advocate trying this idea, but I think, for this author, the question would be not, would it become corrupt? Of course it would. It's how much more corrupt would it be than what we have now?
Interesting, yeah.
Well, I think a good response to that would be to, change the way that in which people are elected. The first past the post winner-takes-all system that Britain and Canada and the States have can be susceptible to populist swings. And there are other ways, one of the things in Northern Ireland, to try to weight different communities together. Because otherwise, I think the risk that you laid out of a new elite like we have, like perhaps in Brussels and the EU, forming that resents the demos, that resents the democratic plebiscite emerging. That's a risk of even a well-intentioned
epistocracy.
Epistocratic epistocracy. So that'd be my response.
And you need to talk to John, because John's been talking about rank order voting for a while. So again, think about what we're, think about some of the issues we're talking about here. And this is the liveliest discussion we've had in this group in one of these meetings for a while, I think. because you guys are thinking, you're asking questions, you're tossing out things.
It's because the last few had about 5 people, I think. So it's kind of
Well, see what happens when you come to meetings, they're a lot more fun. But we need to think about these issues because we've got some very critical decisions to make this year as far as elections. You know, when we think about immigration, when we think about the rights to individual freedoms, when we think about the rights to live our lives, what do we want our world to look like moving forward?
The other thing it doesn't address, I don't think at any point, is how do you enforce it? I think about some horrible scenarios that I've seen laid out, that Trump loses in the fall in a close election. He and his people are going to be screaming, you know, it was a dirty election, and I'm not leaving this office. Okay, at what point do we send in the army to haul him out of there, the police? I mean, what are the enforcement mechanisms to enforce these things? Obviously, they're not in place now.
If I might add, when he proposed to attack cultural sites, if you notice, the Secretary of Defense said, our forces will not attack cultural forests because back during the Nuremberg trials, it's called the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I was in the Navy. You're not obliged, even if you're a general, to follow illegal orders.
Yep, exactly. You know, and a lot of people forget that part of that uniform code. You are not obliged to follow legal orders. But people are scared to step out of line. So, any other questions, thoughts, comments? Carl, I've lost track of time. I'm sorry.
There is hope.
Tell me!
I used to bring my son to humanist meetings. He doesn't always get here for meetings, but he is a humanist. His wife and he are like-minded about politics, religion, and raising their son, who is now about to be 9 months old. And one of the things I credit him with some of his thinking is not just my participation in this and my upbringing, but the fact that my mother helped me until he was 5 years old and instilled in him self-worth, didn't yell at him, oh, now you can't, you know, at an even early age, she'd say, oh, bring that to me when he picks something off the floor. She had one bag for the trash and another one for the toys, or the keepables. That way she could keep him from hurting himself with a stray sewing pin. And he actually he probably knows how to run a sewing machine because he sat beside her from the time he was sitting up in a high chair. But the most important lesson I think she gave to any of her children and to him, be kind to everyone, treat them well, because you don't know who you're related to. And science is pointing out now how interrelated we really are.
Yes, and we are very interrelated. You know, and think about it. So much of what we worry about as human beings are the externals. How we're different from each other. And we forget how much we're really alike. When it boils down to it, we have a lot of the same needs for security, for safety, to be accepted, be part of that community. You know, and the world would be a much better place if we spent our energy finding those commonalities and nurturing those commonalities than saying, well, you're different because your hair is a different color. You're different because, you know, you're attracted to a different gender than I am. I mean, so.
Charles Darwin a long time ago disproved that we're different from the natural world.
Yeah. You know, we're all very much the same, and we have very much the same needs. Yeah.
I can't remember, recently I heard on TV a statistic about how many states, I believe there were 9, it's either 9 states still out of 50 of the United States where a person, man or woman, can still yet be fired for being homosexual. And that's a reality.
Yeah.
It's not something that being thought about. It can be done.
And that's, you think about overtly being fired, but how about people that are forced out or in much more subtle ways? So it's hard to prove that that decision was made based on prejudice, whether it's because of orientation or if you're a woman, maybe because you're childbearing age, or maybe because you're pregnant. So you may end up fired, but they may find another reason, at least on paper, even though the real reason was because they didn't agree with something about you. Lori, I think you had your hand up.
Well, I'm so grateful that you said there is hope, because it made me take a deep breath and go, yeah, because I think sometimes we get so caught up in now that we're not looking at the big leaps that have been made in the last 100 years alone.
Yeah.
And I think as humans, we are getting better at ourselves. And like I look at books, like two, most recently, one fiction. If you look at The Handmaid's Tale,
yes.
And I know the series has been televised and all that, but a lot of people don't read the epilogue to the book. And the front part of the book is all just this theocratic, very negative, very divisive society. But the end of the book is about how we are more alike than different,
yes.
and how we have managed to learn from our mistakes, and we do rise up. And Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now, and I think there was a Sunday or a Saturday session about it, but how important it is for us to look at the statistics and say, let's look at our big leaps, and if we keep having these conversations and we bring these conversations out into our larger communities, we start here as our little nugget, our little humanist people, and then we take them out into our workplaces, into our families, and into our neighborhoods, we're a powerful force.
Yeah.
And the nuns are on the rise, and so I think we're going to see a deluge of people who don't have a place to belong, and I think we just need to give them a soft place to land when they get there.
That's one other big difference I noticed between the humanist statements and the declarations. Get back. The Humanist Association advocates using science and reason for decision making, where it's not even mentioned in there at all.
Yeah.
Even in 1948, there were amazing new, particularly like in physics and
it was
it's
called fusion.
Demonstrated very clearly 3 years prior to that.
Yeah. It's called the bomb.
So science was going forward leaps and bounds at the time, and it's not even mentioned in there. That, like my arguments to my friends on Facebook, which I try not to get into anymore, but is that you can believe what you want, but it has no place in public policy. Public policy should be determined through rational, scientific, and
because when you think about it, belief systems by their very nature tend to be very exclusionary. And the other thing is, and I don't know enough about the committee because, again, I hadn't really thought about this question, but my question now would be, because science wasn't mentioned in that declaration. Eleanor Roosevelt, as far as I know, was not a scientist. I don't know enough about the men on the committee to say were they trained as scientists or not. Because, in my mind, probably not, and that may not have even been on the radar for them at the time. And yes, one of the things that it's interesting when we look at humanism, because we do look at science, we do look at very rational and well thought, we try to be well thought out with our decision making. We're human, so there's always an emotional component. But we are trying to make that step forward, and we're trying to be respectful, and we're trying to be inclusive. We're not perfect, but we're trying to do better. And the other thing is we're not hung up on, we've got all the answers. We're saying we know we don't have all the answers. We're trying to learn and continue to evolve to get better. And I think that's really important. But again, that's my take on it as somebody who's, relatively new to humanism. And, it may not be everybody's reaction to it. It's perfectly valid regardless. Yes, Cal?
Well, I think everything I've heard is all very optimistic, and if the people, the powers that be, were more of a humanist nature, the world would be a better place. But it's not that. In reality, it's like it's idealism from this point of view, and then the powers that be, that's a total antithesis. It's not. It's ugly. I mean, it's just real ugly. And it's not what humanists would hope it to be. It's just the opposite. It's the antithesis. So is evil winning? Who's winning? Humanism doesn't seem to be.
Well, as long as libraries are open and books are not being censored, there is hope.
I mean, I'm optimistic personally. I'm just saying of my observations is that, you take 2 steps forward and 10 backwards, and then you try to recover those 8, and you're still down 2.
Yeah.
I feel the same way that you do.
How do you,
especially after the 2016 election, that was just
come into
flabbergasted.
right? You think that you progressed, and then turns out that it's an illusion. You've actually regressed.
Well,
so
I felt that way for like a year or more, and what makes me feel a little, well, there's like some concrete things that I see improving. Like she just mentioned, there's ranked choice voting, which you vote for your first, second, and third choices, because the reason we have a 2-party system is because of our voting system. Political scientists have shown that when you've got a single winner election, that tends to create just 2 dominant parties. So if we want to have more than 2 parties, which would be better because you'd have better discussion and you wouldn't have 2 parties just fighting in line about each other as much. Ranked choice voting helps with that, and we're getting that. There's a lot of cities now that have it, and it is on the rise. So that's giving me a little bit of hope. But what Lori was saying, I mean, if you look at, I like to think about my own life, and things are getting better during my experience here on this planet, and I worry about that a little bit. But if you look a little bit bigger, we, like our country, gosh, we had a civil war. Those were some bad politics. We were killing each other.
Or for example, the declaration that we've all been perusing by point, which is related to sort of the Constitution and its hypocrisy almost. It's that, here's the ideals and here's reality, and they don't jive. So where do you go from there?
Yeah.
And that's 1948 when they had those. And it's still all idealism. It's not reality. When is it going to become reality? How do you make it reality? And if you really wanted reality, why don't you make it happen? There's so much hypocrisy. It's the word that comes to mind most for me, to say, well, here's the ideals, and then this has been, 80 years ago, 7 years ago, and then you have something happens you think is progress, and then turns out that it's not progress, it's regress. And then you have so-called leaders that don't even have a clue what a humanist declaration is, or even the Constitution, and they're supposed to be the leader of the free world. So what does, it's very discouraging.
And I think
it's
how you asked
that the Civil War hasn't even ended yet.
Right, and might recur. Where's your history to learn from the past? And here you are, maybe repeating that. How could that be? In the realm of a declaration of 1948.
And I think that you asked a really good question, because you said, the ideal and the reality are 2 different things, right?
Right.
And you said, how do we make it happen?
Right.
Because think about it, and I'm going to butcher this quote because it's been quite a while since I've read it, and I can't even remember who said it. I'm sure one of you will know. All that it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to stand by and do nothing.
And that's what's
How do we make these changes? If we think that these things are good things, how do we make these changes? And, maybe I'm being very idealistic. And I know for people that have been in this community a lot longer, burnout happens because you feel like you're trying and trying and trying to make the changes and nothing changes. You're just finally at the point where you're like, I just want to go to the meetings and not have to deal anymore. But if the alternative is to let something bad happen because we stand by and do nothing,
What, to
Can
me,
we
the
really
optimistic
live
note
with
is,
ourselves that way?
I mean, he was elected, as was George Bush, through a quirk in our electoral system. I mean, the electoral college was put into place because they didn't think that the normal, ordinary person was capable
Well,
of voting.
done right there. What about the?
So more people voted for Gore and more people
Right.
voted for Hillary Clinton than they did
Or is
Dumbo.
that really true? Do you really know that to be true?
No,
With the
I'm pretty
Chads
confident it is.
in Florida
So,
and
I'm
Kathleen
confident
Harris.
that 3 million more people voted for Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, and again, this is something that's kind of off the topic right now, as far as the 2016
Corruption is
election.
what I'm getting at.
But the question, I think the fundamental question for us coming out of this discussion today is, you know, we've just talked about a lot of ideals. Our reality doesn't match them.
Right.
Do we want that reality to match or not?
Yeah, according to the Humanist declaration.
And how do we go about then, what do we want to do about it? Those are probably the two questions that need to come out of this. Yeah, I'm sorry, Laura.
No, at the beginning of the, like, this is all just coming, like,
No.
I just had like
Good.
a firework in my head.
Good.
And so.
I'm seeing this.
Yes, so you started the whole lecture with two possibilities, that we could listen to this and we could learn something, or we can listen to this and we can, I don't want to cry, or we could go do
I
something.
think I have tissues.
I'm going to answer your challenge, Catherine, and I'm going to say to all of you sitting here, what I am going to do about this, because I hear you, Cal. I teach high school English. Tuesday, when I go to school, because we have a quiz on Monday, Tuesday, when I go to school, we're going to talk about this in my classroom. And that's going to be my part. I am going to tell 150 kids about this declaration and ask them, do you think this is going to work? Do you think it's idealism? Do you see where it's not working in our communities? And let's write about it. Let's do some more investigative work about it. So I am going to take your challenge, and that's going to be my part. And I'll let you guys know what happens with the kids. And maybe if everybody in this room, instead of churning and stirring and thinking that we're defeated in it, let's take Cal's words and say, let's turn this negative into a positive. What are we going to do when we walk out of this door? Have we just learned something? Which is great on its own. But if we're not willing to do something about it, then what are we doing here? So I hear you. Thank you.
I just wanted to mention, agreeing with that, but I just thought I keep flashing my mind back that I just found a new podcast that Michael Moore just started. And I think all the years he's been putting out documentaries, he's never had a podcast. And he just started 2 weeks ago.
Oh, wow.
So there's only like 10. He said, I'm going to do one a week, but he's done one every day. And when it came to the impeachment and some of the missile strike and the assassination overseas, he has like a Red Alert podcast. But the main thing that's connecting me to that is he gives me a little hope. He's talking about we outnumber them.
Yeah.
We just don't.
We don't know
as ruthless as a group,
Ooh,
as
yeah.
reasonable people aren't as ruthless as the desperate. And he actually connects you to the things that are happening, and he really gets you motivated to, get out, do something. And he's like, that's why I'm doing this. I'm not making any movie for the next year because I'm going to work on this. So I encourage you to look it up. It's called Rumble. He wants us to rumble with Michael Moore. So I just wanted to make sure everyone was aware.
Good, thank you.
I'd like to leave everybody today with the quote from Benjamin Franklin. Look backward on those who have less, not forward on those who have more. If that doesn't make you content, then you don't deserve to be happy. Benjamin Franklin.
Good quote to end on.
I'm not sure your quote wasn't from Einstein, but I'm not sure. I just saw it the other day.
And I can't remember it either, and I keep meaning to look it up, and I don't. I'm lazy. Thank you very, very much, everybody. Your work has been very Lori, if you want to, the notes or the PowerPoint, email me.
Okay, yeah.
Because I'll send you.
Thank you. Yeah, 'cause I, like, my free thinking group that I have, we just had our last meeting on Tuesday, and our next one is on election.
Still do everything right, and still losing.
After we got with that, we worked around with this, now.
No, that was someone else.
So, yes. And now we're on.
Well, it'll be interesting to see from the standpoint of these younger, kids verging on adulthood, these young adults, what their take is.
So in the Christian math, with God, division by zero is possible, right? That would be it, right?
Thank you for being so patient.
Division by zero is possible.
I never quite know whether this one beyond or how to read.
Right, you don't know what
My mind, as soon as you said that, my mind went to.
I have a math, so I went through Ohio State, I took a math, I never finished math. It just didn't resonate.
Turn us loose and
So I was going to try to get an MBA school, I had to take business math, so my first test is 55, second test is 65. I got good,